Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Rusty here and welcome to Steam Clean, where today I'm going to be giving you my impressions on Dawn of War 3, which was developed by Relic Entertainment and published by SEGA. Now I'm only going to be talking about the single player. I tend to just play the single player in these games. I have played the previous two Dawn of Wars, which I enjoyed greatly. Now this one, well, let's say it hasn't been warmly received. In fact, Relic have recently announced that they are going to drop support for the game because of the reception it's received. Which, of course, they aren't blaming on themselves, they're blaming on players. But I kind of think they've only got themselves to blame, really, because of the direction they've taken the franchise in. I mean, first off, as you can see, the campaign there, it's fairly linear. Well, it's incredibly linear, and you switch between different armies. You don't play as the Space Marines for the whole game. You switch between Space Marines, Orcs, and Eldar, which means you don't really get attached to any of the armies. And it kind of feels like a tutorial throughout, because you are constantly learning new stuff for each army, like Elders, Waygates, and Orcs, Scrap Collection, and new units are added and things like that. So, the campaign, this is probably the least satisfying campaign so far. You've got these little story bits at the start, because the story itself as well isn't particularly interesting or surprising. Especially when you compare it to Dawn of War 2, I'd say the highlight of that was probably the Chaos Rising DLC. But before I talk about story, let's just talk about this elite units, because this is kind of a new thing. Dawn of War 2 did give you hero units, but this game you choose elite, or elite even, and now you always have to use the main story one, which is, in this case, Gorguts for the Orcs. But you can choose up to 3. The problem is, there'll be one point where you get a sort of epic elite, which basically can clear up whole armies by itself. So that's another slot that will be taken up. As soon as you unlock those, you will be using that in every mission. So the others, because they're not really tied to the story, you don't care really. Occasionally it'll suggest which one you use, but otherwise I didn't really find myself drawn to any particular unit. You also might have seen the doctrines there, which are a new feature as well. They essentially give you perks during the campaign, each mission. I think you can select up to 3, and they will be attached to the campaign throughout that mission. So different perks like increased damage from certain unit types, or increased resources, or whatever. I'm sure that there will be some that are more overpowered than others, but because the campaign, it feels quite short and you never really get attached to an army, and you unlock them at a fairly slow rate, I didn't find myself sort of drawn to any particular one. And I played it on normal difficulty, so yeah, it wasn't really hard enough to warrant me getting a different kind of doctrine, honestly. So they're not a great feature. I'd much rather they'd been maybe tied to some kind of building, where you could maybe install, you know, the perk in the building with upgrades or whatever. Or maybe attached to leveling up your hero unit, or your elite as they're called in this. But like I said, the problem with the elites there is they're not tied to the story either, except for the main one who you always have to pick. And we'll talk about them in a bit, but they get incredibly boring. Because the biggest problem this game has, and I'm going to give my recommendation now, I think, if you've played Dawn of War 1 or 2, and you liked either of them, but I think maybe you'd have to like both of them to want to play this one, because it's a mishmash of both game types, which I will talk about. So in Dawn of War 1, you had a more traditional RTS game. You would have base building, resource management and acquisition, and huge armies clashing. So it was your genuine, your standard RTS affair. There was also cover-based mechanic, I think, in Dawn of War 1. And what it had over this was 4 armies from the off, I think. And you'd play the whole campaign of each one. So it was a lot more content. There wasn't just this standard story where you have to play as the Orcs and you have to play as the Space Marines and the Eldar. Because this game only has 3 armies from the off, which I think is the lowest, at least in terms of the multiplayer, of any Dawn of War game. And they are getting incredibly stale, the 3 armies. I've always been a fan of the Space Marines, but the kind of fascistic Americans, essentially, are getting a bit boring, and the Eldar as well are also tedious. But what the main problem they've done here with this game is that they've taken Dawn of War 1, the traditional strategy, and they've combined it with Dawn of War 2, which was not a traditional strategy. It did have units that you would move around in a similar way to most strategy games, but it was more similar to almost an action RPG, because you had very small unit base and there was no base building, unlike in Dawn of War 1, where you obviously had base building and you could recruit units and upgrade. No, it had RPG mechanics. You could take, I think it was 4 hero units into each battle. Now they would have a couple of squad mates as well, which you could reinforce during the mission, or you could revive if you had another unit left. But each unit would accrue XP, and you could also collect war gear. So what Dawn of War 3 has done is try to combine both of the games, because some people didn't like the turn to sort of action RPG that Dawn of War 2 did, and some people preferred the original RTS game. Now I liked both, but rather than getting the best of both worlds with Dawn of War 3, we've got watered down versions of both games. So let's take the elite units in this, because that's what I was talking about. In this, the elites do have abilities like they did in Dawn of War 2, but these abilities don't change throughout the game. So, because you'll be using one, for instance in this Orc campaign, you'll be using Gorguts in this Orc mission. His abilities never change. He's got a grappling hook maneuver, and he's got a spinny claw thing, and that's pretty much it. Doctrines maybe will add a perk, a passive perk, but they get incredibly boring to use, the elites in this. And like I said, you change armies all the time, so you probably won't try out all the elites anyway, because there's not a lot of point. They don't really add much. You got really attached to the hero units in Dawn of War 2, and you could level them up in ways you wanted to. You could give them different skills or abilities, which would unlock as you leveled up. Maybe you wanted to play with mostly melee, so you could upgrade your assault units as melee, but you could also get ranged assault units, or you could have a melee dreadnought, or you could have a long-range dreadnought, and you could give them different abilities, which would also give you... You could give them different war gear that would maybe give you a different ability. So it was a lot less tedious, and that was where your sort of RPG, that was where your RPG strategy elements came from in Dawn of War 2. What that also had was cover-based mechanic. So each unit could not only be directed in a certain way to maybe cover an opening, but they could be placed in cover, which would give them more defense. So you could take on large amounts of units. Maybe you put your assault unit in cover and just have it rain down fire on enemies. Very Dawn of War. Whereas in this, cover, as well as the bland hero units that you get bored of, cover, they're basically taking it out. They have added, and maybe we'll see some later, they've added like these little energy domes, which are specific areas on the map you can place your units in. Now in Dawn of War 1 and 2, say you had a crater, Dawn of War 2, say you had a wall even, you could place your units in cover. Depending on the type of wall, you would have different amounts of cover to protect your units, whereas in this, the only area it works is in the little energy domes, which is rubbish. Absolute trash. Now, comparing it to Dawn of War 1, because as you can see now, we've got multiple units. I've got being attacked on both flanks. And in Dawn of War 2, we would have way less than this. We'd have these hero units, and they'd have a few guys with them. So, but they'd be a lot tougher. Because these little guys on the map here, these standard units, like you'd get in Dawn of War 1, do not take much punishment. Space Marines especially feel weak for what they should be. So you'll be upgrading a lot. And the problem with that is, there's a... Before I talk about that, here's a little cover area. You can maybe see it near that turret gun. That sort of little circular thing. I could have stuck some units in there. As you can see, there's no reason to do it because this is a story mission. We'll be going on to the next bit of the map. We're trying to get to the objectives. There's nothing to defend, and when there is something to defend, you maybe don't even get one of those cover units. It's so pointless. For someone who likes turtling in these games, the defense mechanics and the cover is absolute rubbish. Like, it's a massive step backwards to me. So, yeah, I'm not a fan of that at all. Another thing, now I don't know if it was like this in Dawn of War 1, but the units seem very small in this. I know you can zoom in, you can't rotate, and I had the problem, especially with the Orcs and the Space Marines, because the units aren't too distinct. They all looked kind of similar. There's very little to distinguish between them, so I was constantly switching between each one. It's more useful probably to do it on the bar on the bottom, in fact, and you can sort them into groups, which you probably need to do. But yeah, I was confused as to what unit I currently had, and I found in the end, I played through the whole campaign, basically, if I could afford to, just building the most powerful units, sorting them into a blob, and sending them to attack the enemy. And with your elites, kill as many as you can, because they respawn. They have a cooldown timer of, I think it's a couple of minutes, and then you just drop them back in for free. So you might as well use them to do as much damage as possible, because they can take a lot of hits, and then when you get the epic ones at the end, they will just stomp entire armies. Because I have actually finished this, so technically it's more of an impressions than a first impressions. It's not going to be a full review, because I would sort that into different sections maybe, but the end is garbage. I will talk about that for a second. Essentially turns into a boss fight with a demon with the three main characters from the Space Marines, the Eldar and the Orc, and you have to use those three units to take down this boss with massive HP. This game isn't designed to fight bosses, so it doesn't work very well at all, and it just takes a long time of you constantly having to heal and resurrect these hero units that aren't particularly interesting to play as, because, like I said, you've been playing as them the whole time. And story-wise, it's just similar fare of the Eldar are being all mysterious and sneaking about, not really letting anyone know what their end game is until they finally do. The Orcs just want to loot stuff and smash things. I think they've always been my favourite story-wise in these games, because they don't take themselves seriously. You can see some guys are in cover there. You just got to go in and smash it and then you can take it, but then it becomes pointless. Anyway, story. I keep getting sidetracked. Story-wise, it's not particularly interesting. I don't know if in Warhammer lore the armies do sort of get together like that. I assume they would. I can't ever see the Space Marines, Eldar and the Orcs getting together. Maybe to take on Chaos? It would have been nice to see some other armies get involved at some point, even if you couldn't play as them. But there's just a bit of chaos at the end, and that's it. It's you fighting the same old, same old. Yeah, it's Space Marines trying to purge the heretics. It's Eldar trying to save themselves. until they realise that they need the help of the other armies to do that, and then it's the orcs just wanting to loot. But they eventually, for some reason, decide to join up with the Eldar and the Space Marines. After a huge battle near the end, they then team up for whatever reason, despite the fact the whole game you've been fighting against each other with your Relic units, and you've basically taken out, I can't remember who the last campaign is, but it seems a bit silly that you're sort of decimating the other armies with your units, but then at the end you team up. Maybe that's because towards the end there aren't any left, there's just your heroes. Like, almost all the Blood Ravens have been wiped out by then, so... Some people have been complaining about the voice acting. The voice acting in 2 is great, I don't really remember it from 1. And the story is more interesting, a lot more interesting, with the whole turn to chaos and just the fact that you can choose little side missions as well, and each character has something to say, whereas like I say here, the elites don't really get involved. There's a couple maybe that are sort of main characters, and you will know those ones because you'll have to pick them in the missions. That's when they'll have some dialogue, but most of the elites you can choose have nothing to say and aren't integral to the story at all. And in fact, they'll all be gone by the end anyway. There'll just be the 3 main ones left. It's a Farseer, Gabriel Angelos, is that what he's called? And Gorgut, who I think they've also changed the voice actors for. But I think the orcs are still pretty decent. But there's nothing particularly interesting, story-wise. Or combat-wise, as you can see, it's just who's got the biggest blob, who can get their hero character in there to do enough damage. You've probably been seeing in this footage that that's what I'm doing most. I'm sending in my more powerful units and my hero unit to take out infantry and basically leaving the rest there. There will be some odd instances where I'll leave them to defend. Now, you might have also seen some resource points and buildings, because this does have buildings. But because you're moving throughout the level, generally there's not that much base building. A few missions will have you had to build a base, but you don't really expand that base. You just build your main base and then that's it. You can't really defend it because, like I said, you can't build turrets for one, which is something I haven't said, and you can't put units in cover. So if your base ever gets attacked on a mission where you have to build a base, you're going to have to send units back, or you're going to have to leave some there, which adds to probably my biggest sort of nitpick with the whole campaign, or even complaint, because it is irritating, is the micromanaging of the units and your base. Because you can't put a turret down to guard the base, you obviously have to micromanage the defense when it comes up. And because the units all have abilities, pretty much, you constantly have to micromanage in battle if you want to get them to do the most damage. Especially as you've got the 3 hero units that have usually 2 or 3 abilities themselves. So I was kind of relieved when I unlocked the Super Mega Elite, because I could just send that in and I didn't have to micromanage all these minor units that had activated abilities and whatnot. It's just frustrating to manage a big army like that. So building a base here was just an objective, and what we do now is what I would do if I was playing Dawn of War 1, is I would start building maybe some turrets to defend it. Get my units out to build some listening posts, which you can do in this. That's how you get your resources, which are requisition and power. But you can't defend them, obviously. You've got to use units to defend them, and because there's no cover, you have to use quite a lot if you want to defend them. So I found it was best to just try and complete the map as quickly as possible, rather than build up any defences, build up enough units so you can not only attack the objective, but you can defend all these listening posts. The other problem also with requisition and resources in this game is that they are limited. They're capped, I think, on each mission. So there's only a certain number of units you can get, unit cap and power cap. And the power especially, I always found I was low on. That's the little lightning bolt. You get plenty of requisition, but most of the high level units require power. So I found I would have these units and they would die because they die quite quickly. And I found I wasn't able to reinforce them when some of the units died. Or buy new units, obviously, which you want to do when you get powerful ones. Especially when you're fighting maybe more powerful enemies like these Space Marines here. But annoyingly as well, what you have to do to reinforce the units, in Dawn of War 2, not only did you have I think it was a rally button, or a retreat button, which would send your particular unit that you retreated back to a rally point, which would reinforce that unit. Not only that, but they would sprint back to that building. Whereas here, as you can see there, I'm reinforcing the unit. You have to send them back to your base to reinforce. There's no button to get them to flee to the base so you can quickly reinforce the unit. There's no auto reinforcing, unless maybe you can use a doctrine for that. I'm not quite sure. I think there's one doctrine that your elites can use to do that, but or maybe your special epic elites can do that. But reinforcing is just a pain in the arse, insofar that I felt if I didn't need to do it, I just wouldn't bother, because you have to send them all the way back to your base and then click on that resource reinforce button. And resources wise, I might not even have enough. Because like here I'm taking on a tank and some assault marines. I don't know if I was balanced enough for it. I think I had some anti-tank units. But essentially you just want to pile it on, because I'm not using any abilities or anything here because it's too fiddly. So there are a lot of problems. It's a mishmash of both games. It's not the best version of either. So we've got minimal base building, minimal upgrades, we've got lessened RPG mechanics, we've got weaker heroes, and less tactical combat. The story's also not great, so you might be wondering why I recommended it, and I think I'm only going to recommend it for the campaign to fans of the original 2, because whilst it's not as good as either, it's still solid in its way. There's still something to be had for people who enjoy Dawn of War. It looks nice. It's nice to be playing a game with these characters and these units that looks this nice. Although I would say that the step up in terms of like design, there isn't really one. It's not very creative. I mean, this level, for instance, is very sort of grey and boring and metallic, which a lot of them are. People have complained that there's not enough destruction. It doesn't look decayed, or, you know, like Warhammer 40k is meant to be grim dark. It's meant to be all fucked up. Whereas this is a bit sterile and clean. I had a bigger problem with just everything looking the same. There's not very many interesting environments. So later on you go to, I think it's a planet that's come out of the warp, and that also looks sort of grey as well. There's maybe some like blue energy and all that nonsense, but even the Eldar home base, or the Craft World thing, there's a Craft World mission that you go on, is not particularly interesting. I think there was one ice planet, whereas Dawn of War 2 had all these different locations that you could go to, all these different environments, biomes, and you could choose the order in which you wanted to go to them as well. So none of that here. You're just doing a linear campaign. Is there a difference between each army? Yes, each one plays fairly differently, although like I said, it's just get blob, attack other blob. But there are different ways to play. I just don't think it's long enough, and the missions aren't maybe expansive enough to take advantage of that. If we were just playing as one army, it would probably have worked better. Or if it was, say, like Retribution, where you had a campaign for each army, then that would have been a lot better. Because here, you don't feel like you sort of get to utilise. Maybe the Eldar is the only one, because they have this sort of mobility where they can move their base around. And I did find myself doing that on one mission. They also have units you can teleport. But that was because the campaign mission specifically needed you to do that. So you had to move the base. The orcs' special thing is picking up scrap, which they can use to upgrade stuff. That just was like another micromanaging thing to me that just irritated me. And I'm doing it occasionally in this game, but usually I just didn't bother because it was just, yeah, more micromanaging. You could also use Gretchen to build certain vehicles from the scrap. But then you've got the resource problem again. I mean, you've probably seen throughout this video, if you've been watching the bottom left, that the lightning bolt, which is the power, has remained low throughout. Because you don't get, for some reason, and the only ways to get it, I believe, are from the requisition points, where you can upgrade them, but the upgrades don't seem to do a lot for your power. They just do it for requisition, which I had an abundance of in pretty much every mission. So when you have to defend on a campaign mission, then that's usually down to the wire, and you better hope your hero units tough it out there, because your other units will just get slaughtered, and you just need to hope that you make it to the time limit. And a lot of the defend missions were like that. They weren't fun. You couldn't sort of put down turrets or find good areas of cover, which Dawn of War 2 was great at, and you couldn't build your hero units around those missions because you can't upgrade their abilities. You can just cosmetically change the skins on them, I think. So yeah, it's very disappointing, but because of Relic's statement that they're dropping support for it, and because of, I think, the original reaction to it, the price is like incredibly low at the moment. And if you like the multiplayer as well as the single player, then it's definitely worth getting. I mean, if you liked it for the previous games anyway, because while this might be worse than both, and it is, definitely, for the reasons I've given, it's still kind of quite enjoyable. I mean, like I say, I did the campaign. You get a bit of fun out of the massive amount of hero units to play with. The story's not the worst thing, and there's quite a lot of variety. Even though it feels like a tutorial, you are getting to play as each different army. It would have been nice to see, like I said, other armies, or maybe focus more on one army, maybe play a couple of missions as another, maybe not have the story as cliched with the Eldar being all mysterious and whatnot, and then you fighting a bloody boss battle at the end. Maybe bring in the elite units sooner, but don't let you recruit them every mission, because once you've got them, I mean, on the multiplayer, I imagine it's just a rush to get those, because they can just kill entire armies. They have ridiculous moves that just, like the Imperial one, well, it is an Imperial unit, but it's Space Marines one, is what they call Titans. I think it's almost a Titan, and it has like a chain gun thing that just kills, you know, you'll kill bigger units easily, like Wraith Guards and whatever. And the Eldar one is a Wraith Knight, which is also ridiculous. And the Orcs is some kind of big mecha, whatever it's called, mecha big knobs. You know what they have their names for, the Orcs. And they all play fairly similarly as well, so that's a shame. Maybe if they were a bit more varied. It just gets stale a lot quicker than the other games and doesn't ever excel at any point. So it's a shame, because this is the last one, probably, we're going to get. Seeing as Relic seem to have dropped this one. Which is a shame. They're not like taking responsibility and saying, yeah, we fucked up here. We've made a game that people aren't enjoying. We shouldn't have tried to combine both Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2. We should have just, well, picked one or the other, you know? And yeah, I think that's all I've really got to say about it, honestly. You'll know if you want to check it out. Check the price out. I think it's ridiculously cheap. There's a sale on for it at the moment. But I couldn't recommend it at full price. Especially if you don't like Dawn of War 2 or say Dawn of War 1. And if you've never played either, then definitely don't get this as your first one. Because you'll just think, what is this? This is garbage. Because it fails as a strategy game, it fails as an action RPG. It's a mediocre version of both of those things. It's a cut back version. And it's a disappointing way to end a series that got probably quite a lot of people into 40k that had never played the tabletop game or collected the figurines or whatever, which is what I used to do. I used to collect them, I never used to play it. I just used to like painting them and reading the lore. And that's not even that interesting here. So I'd only recommend you get it while it's on sale. And it's already been reduced massively. It's under £10 I think now, so if you're really into the franchise, then get it. You might be a bit disappointed, but you can sort of see it out. You might even like it more than I did. Maybe you'll like this combination of the two games, but I just find it's a weak version of both. Anyway, goodbye heretics. I will see you next time.